Hello everyone, welcome to today's talk on grief and loss. It's not a topic that is generally felt as one that's easy to open up about because it's painful and it's hard. Normally we associate grief with death, and generally that involves the loss of a loved one. For me and for others, in my experience, it can be described or could be described as one of the most painful experiences or events in our life that we go through. And it's not unusual when we experience pain for us to avoid that. So when we're faced with the event or faced with talking about the event with others, we move away from it or avoid it. Of course we do, that's human. Talking about death can be frightening for people, and understandably, when facing fear, we do what we can to protect ourselves and those around us. And whether that's the person experiencing loss themselves, or whether it's the people who are around the person who has experienced that loss. It's no one's fault, but it can feel very lonely for the person who is going through their grief stage of their loss. So, to begin with, or to say more, I want to offer some insight into the terms around loss and death, starting with grief. And what I want to say about grief is that it's very unique. There are so many ways in which we can experience grief, and so many ways in which grief can show up. When we experience loss, it can involve the end of a career, it can involve the end of a relationship, it can involve the loss of a part of ourselves. Nobody will have lived the life of that person, so nobody will have the same experience. And that's why I started by saying that grief is so unique. And as I said, there are many, many types of losses, and no one way to grieve. So grief, or grieving, is what happens inside of us. It's what's felt, and it is a normal response to loss of any kind. Often I hear how clients experience well-intended others telling them how they should be or what will be helpful and ways to move on. And clients can experience this as a kind of an internal battle, because not only do they find themselves or can find themselves battling with their own feelings of loss, they can also find themselves battling with kindness of others versus expressing their truths. And that's how counselling can help. We can compound feelings of emptiness, loss and loneliness when we end up compromising our truth. And that might have roots in old patterns where we are protecting other people or more concerned for other people than we are for ourselves. So how we've lived our lives can feature in how we respond to others, even in our grief, and that can shape our mourning. So mourning is what we do outside of ourselves. So it's more about our environment and how other people experience us, what's happening outside of us. Normal grief can evoke a whole range of emotions and feelings after loss. So research informs us, and studies around loss and grief show that survivors can typically display characteristics which can include bodily distress of some kind, like anxiety, because of what's felt. What I mean by that is that grief can provoke hostile reactions or behaviours. So anxiety can feel like fear and can be displayed as anger, which is very accessible as an emotion and can be used to protect something inside of us. So behaviour and reactions might look like aggression. This is also normal too, and can happen instinctively, as I say, in response to something that is felt inside, perhaps protecting the self from pain, or something else. Other normal feelings in grief can include sadness, guilt, loneliness, fatigue, shock, and relief. And that's just to name a few or some of what can happen after we experience grief or loss. Physical sensations might include tightness in the chest, tightness in the throat, difficulty getting words out, hollowness or an emptiness inside the stomach, a dry mouth, lack of energy, shortness of breath. All of these things might seem like depression, and this is closely linked to grief and loss, and that can be explored as well in counselling when you're processing what's happened to you. We go to our minds, we need our minds, we have thoughts, and the mind can conjure up thoughts following loss, and we can end up going in all kinds of directions, and we can experience confusion, disbelief, preoccupation, and this kind of sense of searching when things end. And that's really normal too, in grief or when something has ended. And it's important for me to say that more when things have ended, because the grief process can be experienced at the end of something. Service users might have experienced or might be in a grief process because of what they've lost in life. And that can be worked through, if time is taken out to explore it and see what's happening inside and explore the past. Behaviours frequently associated with loss might look like sleep disturbance as well, loss of appetite, absent-mindedness, social withdrawal and crying and sighing. And these are just to name a few. So as I mentioned, mourning is something that happens outside, and again is a process that people go through after loss. So it can be helpful to view mourning in stages, and in doing this, acknowledge in ourselves that we don't get over loss, we don't move on from loss, we learn to live with it. So where it can feel huge and all-consuming to begin with, over time it can become smaller, So although it's there, it changes shape as we grow around it. So the first stage, I suppose, if we were to look at it as stages, the first stage in mourning would be to come full face with the reality that the person or the part of our life has gone or ended. And this can be incredibly hard and can be met with denial, denying the loss or the meaning of the loss, removing anything that connects us with the loss to help minimize it and block out memories. And that can be a very physiological response or a very cognitive response. Coming to the acceptance of loss takes time. So whilst we can acknowledge the reality, it can be hard to take. So we find ourselves avoiding acceptance by defending pain, which is completely understandable. But this is such an important part of processing what's happened. And with the right support and the right conditions, I suppose, this can happen. We can move through that part safely. So it is necessary and helpful to acknowledge and work through pain. It lessens the risks of this manifesting then into something physical or behaviours. Not getting help to work through grief or avoiding or suppressing pain can prolong mourning, and this can be harder later on to process when the person finds that they've reached a point where they're full. And that can be about all patterns, depending on how we've lived our lives. And it can be triggered by loss and grief. So although not everyone experiences the same intensity of pain, anyone who has experienced loss, who has been deeply attached, can expect some level of pain, whatever that attachment is, whether it's an attachment to a person who's passed away, an attachment to a partner and that relationship's ended, whether it's an attachment to a career and that's ended, a pet, so anyone who experiences loss and has been attached in some way can expect a level of pain. Timing can make a difference as to when we get the support that grief counselling offers. So as I explained, sometimes it can be harder to process the longer we leave it, the more layers that form around it, the harder it is to access that emotional pain. But it's not always the case. So in principle, grief counselling or counselling around a grief process can be of benefit for all loss, based on the assumption that loss, and in particular death, is very traumatic. Some people prefer not to explore counselling straight away, and whilst there is the evidence to suggest that leaving it for too long makes it harder to process, there is no right or wrong way, and there's no correct time, and no one is judged for making the choices that they make when things come to an end. Research informs us, though, and supports that counselling can help with loss. So based on what I've learned and based on my own personal experience, creating a safe and supportive space for clients is the priority, because it allows that client to express freely how they're feeling without judgment, and understand more about what is happening inside of them. Clients can use this to help them identify and understand and accept their feelings. By talking things through, clients can learn to adapt in time to the loss, because by talking things through with someone else, there is this facilitation and an ability to live without the loss, whether that's the loved one or the end of something, whatever that means. So it is supporting people through their struggle and help them with their decision making about how they want to move forward, not on, but forward. A counselling relationship can offer something unique where survivors can experience time away from friends and family. Again, if we think about how people may have lived their lives and expectations, sometimes it's hard for people to be or say what they really need to. A counselling environment allows them to do that and gives them that space to process. So there are no expectations, no judgment. And it can help people in time find meaning beyond the meaning itself or the event itself. Meaning is really important. And again, it's relative and personal, and it takes time. And it's part of that process that clients go through when they are coming to terms with and working through the end or the loss. The thing about meaning is it doesn't require anybody else to understand it necessarily. And even when you do find the meaning for yourself about how you're going to move forward or live your life, it doesn't mean that what you experience, particularly when we are processing the end or the loss of a loved one, it doesn't mean that how you experienced and how you felt and feel at times is gone, because it's part of who you are. It just enables you to move around it and for it to sort of change as you change. Meaning is a way to, I suppose if I was to say what I said right at the beginning, really, to grow around your grief and move forward through stages. So it is still there, you know. Grief doesn't go away, but it does change, and we change gradually and slowly as we go through those different stages and process our loss and recreate connections with other loved ones and replace painful experiences with something else, whatever that means. I hope you found this helpful. As I said right at the start, grief is probably one of the most painful and isolating experiences that we face in our lives. But we don't have to be alone in that. And whilst it's hard to open up and express all that we feel, whatever that means, you know, what people go through is normal and unique. And having somebody to work through that will enable that person to process what they've gone through in a healthy and safe space. So I want to thank you for listening, and I hope that this has been helpful to you. I'll see you again. Bye bye for now.